The forest was quiet the morning the officers reached the cabin, too quiet for what they were about to witness. Their boots pressed into the frozen ground as they approached the weathered door, their breaths tight, their minds fighting the thought that this could actually be real. 42 years of silence, 42 years of a name whispered in grief, and now this moment hanging in the air like a held breath. A soft rustle came from inside. Someone was moving. The lead detective raised his hand to knock, a single sharp echo against the old wooden frame. When the door creaked open, the world seemed to stop. A woman stepped into view, her face lined by decades of isolation, her eyes watchful, unsure, almost startled by the presence of strangers. The detective's voice cracked as he whispered to his partner, "Could this really be her?" It shouldn't have been possible. The girl who vanished in seconds on a Detroit driveway, the child whose name haunted an entire city, was standing right there, grown, breathing, blinking at them like a question the world never expected to answer. The officers held out a faded photograph. The woman hesitated. Her eyes drifted toward it. Her hand trembled. There in that picture was a 6-year-old child with fierce pigtails and a chalk-stained grin. A little girl who should have lived a full life. A little girl who should have come home. The woman's gaze locked onto the image, and she froze. Not a flinch, not a breath. Just a storm of confusion and recognition fighting inside her. Everything was wrong. Everything was impossible, but everything was suddenly real. Before we start, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Cases like this vanish from the news fast. Don't miss the next breakthrough. Subscribe. If a child can disappear for 4 decades without anyone noticing, think about what could be happening around you right now. Don't stay uninformed. Subscribe so you're never the last to know. And if you still won't, tell us in the comments. Why take that risk? The woman at the doorway didn't speak. She simply stared at the photograph the officers held between them, her chest rising in uneven, fragile breaths. The moment stretched, uncomfortable and raw, as though the entire forest leaned in to listen. Every second felt heavy, carrying decades of pain none of them dared put into words. Her eyes sharpened on the image, the little girl smiling with chalk dust on her fingers, a small, bright T-Rex drawn behind her, a driveway that should have been safe, a day that should have been ordinary. The woman's lips parted slightly, not a word, just a faint sound, like something inside her cracking. The lead detective swallowed hard. His hands were steady, but his voice wasn't. "Do you recognize her?" The question didn't land like a question at all. It sounded more like a plea, a quiet, desperate hope that after 42 years of silence, the truth might finally speak back. The woman blinked slowly, her fingers lifted toward the photo, stopping just short of touching it, as if afraid that making contact would make everything collapse. Her eyes glimmered. Confusion, fear, something deeper fighting for room, something she couldn't name. Her past was colliding with her present, and none of them were ready for what that collision would reveal. She vanished without a sound, yet here she stands, alive. The truth hit with the force of a punch, the kind that leaves you breathless. Has a case ever shaken your community so deeply that people still whisper about it decades later? The kind of story that makes parents hold their kids closer, the kind that shapes an entire city's memory. Her parents spent 42 years waking up every morning hoping today would be different. 42 years of birthdays without candles. 42 years of staring at an empty driveway. Pain like that doesn't fade. It buries itself in the bones. So how does a child vanish in seconds, without a cry, without a struggle, without a trace? To answer that, we have to return to the day that shattered everything. The woman lowered the photo slowly, her hand trembling as if the weight of that small paper could crush her. The detectives watched every flicker across her face. Confusion, shock, a kind of buried recognition trying to claw its way to the surface. It was as if the life she lived, the one she thought she understood, had just split open. She whispered, barely audible, "Who is she?" Those words broke the last fragile certainty the officers had been holding on to. The lead detective closed his eyes for a moment, fighting the sting behind them. He had spent years studying the details of the missing child, the chalk drawings, the tiny sock the wind had carried into the rosebush, the driveway where a father had stood screaming her name. Now the woman who should have been a memory stood breathing in front of him. For 42 years, the city had carried the question like a wound that refused to close. How does a little girl disappear in seconds? A quiet street, a bright afternoon, parents only steps away. No struggle, no witnesses, no trace, except a chalk dinosaur and a missing sock that didn't belong on the ground. Detroit had asked itself that question every September. Reporters revisited it whenever hope flickered. Neighbors carried guilt they could never put down. A mother prayed with a voice that cracked more each year. A father stayed awake through countless nights, staring at a door that never opened again. People moved away. People grew old. People forgot, but the pain stayed exactly where it had been dropped. Now that question, the one that haunted an entire city, stood wrapped in human form, confused, afraid, and staring at her own 6-year-old face. Her existence wasn't just unbelievable, it was a challenge to everything people thought they knew about safety, about family, about the world they trusted. 42 years without answers. 42 years without closure. 42 years waiting for the truth to rise from the darkness. Today, that truth stood trembling in a doorway. And to understand how any of this could happen, we need to go back to the moment everything was taken. The afternoon carried a kind of gentle warmth that families cherish without realizing it's the last time they'll ever feel it. The Simmons home sat quietly on Belcrest Street, wrapped in the easy calm of early autumn. Leaves rustled along the sidewalk as Rahel crouched on the driveway with chalk staining her fingers, humming softly as she dragged long purple lines across the concrete. Her parents watched from the porch swing, letting the creak of the chains set the rhythm of their conversation. Anya leaned into Dexter's shoulder, enjoying a moment of peace, unaware that the world was about to tear itself open. She smiled at her daughter, that gap-toothed grin, the fierce pigtails bouncing every time she shifted her weight, and those mismatched socks she refused to give up. Rahel attacked the driveway with the kind of focus only a child can hold. A giant chalk dinosaur stretched across the concrete, big, bold, and full of the wild imagination her parents adored. The colors smeared onto her knees and elbows as she whispered little stories to herself, lost in a world where nothing bad ever happened. Not yet. The air was calm, the kind of calm that gives parents the illusion that everything around them is safe, that nothing cruel could possibly touch their home. A gentle breeze nudged a few leaves across the lawn, and the sound blended into the soft tapping of Rahel's chalk. Nothing signaled danger, nothing carried warning, no shadow crept close, no sound hinted at the chaos approaching. This moment, this quiet hour, was the final breath of a life that was about to collapse. Have you ever turned away for just 5 seconds and wished you could take those seconds back? This family thought one quiet afternoon was safe, until it wasn't. If you believe awareness protects the people you love, subscribe. And if you refuse, explain in the comments. Why ignore stories that could shield your family? The shift began with something so ordinary it almost feels cruel in hindsight. The kitchen phone rang with that sharp, demanding tone every parent knows too well. The kind that forces you to step away for just a moment. Anya sighed, brushed her palms against her jeans, and walked inside. She didn't rush. Why would she? Her daughter was right there on the driveway, only a few steps from the porch. Safe, close, laughing. She answered the phone expecting something simple, something neighborly, and that's exactly what it was. A minor complaint about a fence line from Ms. Periwinkle next door. A few comments back and forth. Nothing serious, nothing worth remembering. Just a handful of minutes. Minutes she would replay for the next 42 years. Outside, Dexter stayed on the porch, rocking gently on the swing. His eyes drifted from Rahel to the sound of an ice cream truck rolling slowly down the street. The melody chimed in the distance. tugging at memories of his own childhood. He smiled without thinking, watching the truck pause 2 houses away, then continue on. It was harmless, completely harmless. A moment of nostalgia, a brief distraction, nothing more. He turned his head back to the driveway, expecting to see his daughter exactly where she'd been, kneeling over her masterpiece, talking to her chalk dinosaur as if it could hear her. But the space was empty. No child, no movement, no sound except the wind brushing along the pavement. The chalk dinosaur lay untouched, every line bold, every color exactly where she'd left it. The pink chalk lay by its foot, split slightly from use. But the artist was nowhere. Seconds. That's all it took. The kind of seconds every parent wishes they could grab and drag back into their hands. Dexter stepped off the porch with a slow, puzzled frown. He didn't call out at first. He expected to see Rahel just outside his line of sight, maybe shifting to add a tail to her dinosaur or reaching for a new chalk color. But as he moved closer, the silence tightened around him. No humming, no small footsteps, no soft chatter from a child lost in her imagination. He scanned the yard with growing urgency, his heartbeat quickening as he circled the driveway. The chalk lines were crisp, the colors bright against the concrete. Her artwork looked alive, full of the energy she'd poured into it only minutes before. But she was nowhere near it. His breath hitched. "Rahel?" He tried to keep his voice steady, but it wavered. He called again, louder this time, and the sharpness in his tone cut through the quiet street. Nothing answered him. He checked the nearby shrubs, the edge of the porch, the narrow strip between the garage and the fence, every spot that could possibly hide a playful 6-year-old. His movements grew frantic, movements powered by disbelief turning into fear. Where could she have gone? How far could she have moved in such a tiny window of time? Then he noticed something that didn't belong, a single sock, one of her mismatched favorites, clinging to the thorn of a rose bush a block away. The colors were unmistakably hers. The sight hit Dexter so hard he felt his knees weaken. He shouted her name with everything inside him. Still nothing, only the wind carrying back the echo of a father's panic. The driveway held her drawing. The chalk held her fingerprints. But the space where she should have been was empty. That emptiness would soon swallow an entire city. Dexter's voice tore through the calm street so violently that doors flew open before people even understood what they were hearing. His shout wasn't the kind a parent uses to call a child inside for dinner. It was raw, frantic, filled with a terror that made neighbors drop whatever they were doing and sprint toward the driveway. He was already stumbling across the yard, yelling Rahel's name over and over, each call more desperate than the last. His voice broke, cracked, then rose again with a kind of strength fueled only by fear. People leaned over fences, raced down their porches, clutching their chests as they moved, hoping they'd misheard him, hoping this wasn't what it sounded like. But they saw his face, pale, shaking, drenched in panic. And they knew something was terribly wrong. Within seconds, the quiet Detroit block burst into motion. Neighbors spread out in every direction, checking under porches, behind garages, through bushes, calling her name with a shaken urgency. Feet pounded against grass and pavement as if the ground itself was demanding answers. A few children peeked from windows, confused by the sudden chaos outside. But there was no rustle of tiny footsteps, no giggling from a hiding place, no sign of a child who should have been within sight. One neighbor ran toward the end of the street, another checked the alley, another jogged to the backyard of the Simmons home. Still nothing. Panic grew heavier by the second, tightening around everyone like a noose. Dexter clutched the edge of his car, gasping for air, his hands shaking so badly he nearly collapsed. A mother's scream from 2 houses over cut through the air. "Check everywhere, she has to be here." But she wasn't. 6 minutes. That's all it took to pull a child out of a community and erase her without a sound. Who takes a child in daylight without leaving a trace? Flashlights clicked on even though the sun was still out. That's how desperate everyone became. People searched places no child could possibly fit, simply because the alternative was unthinkable. Neighbors combed through bushes, lifted trash can lids, checked under cars, and peered into every open garage on the block. The air filled with the sound of frantic footsteps and sharp, trembling voices calling Rahel's name. Within minutes, the first patrol car screeched onto Bellcrest Street. Officers jumped out before the wheels stopped turning, radios buzzing against their shoulders. The neighborhood swarmed around them, breathless, pointing in every direction at once. The officers tried to establish order, but panic moved faster than protocol ever could. Dexter kept circling the driveway. His hands trembled as he grasped at anything that might help. The chalk lines, the tiny handprints smudged on the concrete, the dinosaur Rahel had been drawing with so much joy. It felt impossible that something so bright and innocent could sit untouched while his daughter was nowhere in sight. One officer knelt beside the drawing and frowned. There were no skid marks, no broken branches, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had dissolved into thin air. Another officer spotted something near the edge of the driveway. The pink chalk Rahel had been holding moments before. It lay exactly where she had dropped it, untouched, unmoved by wind or footsteps. A small fragment of her world frozen in place. Neighbors kept shouting, "Check the backyard!" She couldn't have gone far. She was right here. But every second that passed made it clearer. The search was yielding nothing. Not a footprint, not a sound, not a single clue pointing toward where she had gone. The officers exchanged uneasy looks. This wasn't a wandering child. This was something deliberate, something planned. And someone out there knew exactly what they were doing. The neighborhood search was collapsing into exhaustion and disbelief when the radio crackled with a new voice. Steady, older, carrying the weight of years on the job. Moments later, Sergeant Harlan Klein stepped out of his cruiser, his jaw tight as he surveyed the chaos. He'd handled missing children before, but something about the stillness on that driveway made his stomach twist. Klein crouched near the chalk dinosaur, studying every detail with eyes sharpened by experience. The drawing was untouched, not smeared, not stepped on, no drag marks, no scuff from a struggle. Everything about it screamed one thing. Whatever happened here took place in complete silence. He scanned the perimeter. Officers were shouting updates. Neighbors were crying. Some were still searching behind houses with trembling hands. But Klein focused on details. The small, quiet things others overlooked in their panic. That's when another officer approached, holding something carefully in his gloved hand. A sock. Not just any sock. One of the odd, mismatched socks Rahel loved wearing. It had been found a block away, caught on a thorn of a rosebush. Too far for a child to wander in the time she vanished. Too clean to have been dragged through dirt or gravel. Too intentional to ignore. Klein's chest tightened. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a child slipping away unseen. Someone had moved fast, confident, and without leaving chaos behind. He looked back toward the driveway, at the chalk dinosaur glowing in the afternoon light. It hadn't been disturbed. That was the part he couldn't shake. A child disappearing without noise, without struggle, without warning, meant only one thing. Whoever took her knew exactly what they were doing. Someone planned this, executed it flawlessly, and left the entire street with nothing but a drawing, a chalk stub, and a sock that didn't belong on the ground. At first, the phones never stopped ringing. Every hour, a new voice claimed they had seen a little girl who looked just like Rahel. A woman swore she saw her at a bus stop in Toledo. A truck driver insisted he spotted her walking along a highway in Ohio. A teenager said a girl with mismatched socks was crying outside a corner store on 8 Mile Road. Each call sent officers racing out the door. Each one dragged Dexter and Anya through another surge of hope, followed by another crash. And every time the phone rang, Anya grabbed it before anyone else could. Her hands shook so badly she often misdialed returning calls. She couldn't risk missing the one that might finally be real. But none of them were. Not one. Within weeks, the tips doubled, then tripled. People called out of fear, guilt, imagination, or the simple desire to feel helpful. The more the story spread, the more the lines filled with claims that fell apart within minutes. An officer would return to the Simmons home, hat in hand, voice low, delivering the same message again and again. It wasn't her. We checked. It wasn't Rahel. Another false lead. Each time, Dexter's shoulders would tense before he forced them back down. He tried to look strong for Anya, but holding himself together was becoming its own battle. He barely slept. He barely ate. He paced the living room floor until sunrise, studying old photos of Rahel, terrified he would forget even the smallest detail of her face. By the end of the first month, the tip line grew quieter. Not because people cared less, but because every caller started doubting what they saw before they ever reached for the phone. The noise didn't end. It thinned. And in that thinning, hope began to wobble. When the FBI entered the case, the entire neighborhood seemed to exhale for the first time. Agents arrived with confidence, scanners, mapping tools, and a presence that made people believe answers were finally on the way. The Simmons family clung to that hope. For a while it seemed possible that someone, somewhere, would catch a thread that led back to Rahel. But weeks passed, then months, and the questions piled higher than the evidence. The agents sifted through call logs, interviewed neighbors again and again, and rechecked every inch of Bellcrest Street. They examined backgrounds of people with past offenses, questioned drifters, scanned abandoned houses, and pulled surveillance tapes from stores blocks away. Every possibility was considered, every angle tested, but nothing connected. Nothing pointed to a direction, nothing made sense. The day the FBI quietly stepped back from the investigation, the house felt colder. There was no announcement, no sudden gathering, no dramatic moment. Just a gradual decrease in visits, fewer updates, fewer suits at the door. Eventually it became clear. They had taken the case as far as they could, and the path had led nowhere. That withdrawal hit the Simmons family harder than they admitted out loud. Dexter grew restless, pacing like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Anya grew inward, speaking less, sleeping less, tracing the edges of Rahel's drawings with her fingertips as though she could pull life out of chalk lines. Arguments started small. You're not listening. I am listening. No, you're somewhere else again. Soon silence replaced the arguments, a silence filled with grief that had nowhere to go. They began living like two ghosts drifting through the same house, bound by a loss they couldn't explain and couldn't find their way out of. By the first anniversary of Rahel's disappearance, the neighborhood had changed. Children no longer played unsupervised. Parents glanced over their shoulders more than they spoke. Doors that once stayed unlocked at dusk now clicked shut before sunset. Yet every September 11th, people gathered on Bellcrest Street with one purpose: to remember the little girl who never came home. It started small, just the Simmons family, a few neighbors, and a box of purple chalk, Rahel's favorite color. They knelt on the pavement, tracing hearts and dinosaurs the way she once did. Some wrote her name. Others wrote prayers. The drawings spread like a quiet promise across the street she used to run on. Year after year, more people joined. Families from other neighborhoods. Teachers who never taught Rahel but felt the weight of her story. Teenagers who weren't even born in 1982 but knew the case because everyone in Detroit knew it. The purple chalk became a symbol, a reminder that a child could vanish in moments and still leave a mark on a city's heart. Over time, the annual vigil grew into something larger. News stations covered it. Churches lit candles. Strangers who never met the Simmons family arrived carrying flowers or handmade signs. People whispered her name like it belonged to someone they had lost personally. And slowly, Rahel Simmons became more than a missing child. She became a story parents told their kids as a warning. She became the face on flyers that never faded from shop windows. She became a quiet thread in Detroit's identity. The girl who slipped away, the girl people hoped would be found, the girl whose chalk drawings outlasted entire generations. Locals began calling it the chalk case, not out of disrespect, but because that little dinosaur drawing became a symbol of everything they refused to forget. But symbols aren't answers, and remembering isn't the same as finding. As the years pressed forward, the file on Rahel Simmons grew heavier, but not any clearer. Detectives rotated in and out of the department, each one taking a turn staring at the same thin stack of evidence that had baffled everyone before them. New officers promised fresh eyes. Older ones warned that some cases simply freeze and never thaw. Rahel's did exactly that. Leads stopped coming. Witnesses moved away. memories blurred. Bellcrest Street no longer buzzed with hope. It simply learned to live with the ache. Every September, the purple chalk returned. But even those gatherings started thinning as newer tragedies pushed older ones aside. The Simmons family stood at each vigil, looking smaller, more worn down, like grief had carved permanent lines into their faces. Detroit didn't forget Rahel, but it stopped expecting answers. And that is how a case dies, not with a declaration, but with silence swallowing the last echo of urgency. Most missing children never return home. Staying aware could save someone near you. Subscribe now. Don't wait until the next case turns cold. And if you still choose not to, explain in the comments why. Why take that chance? By the time Detective Nia Holloway stepped into the cold case unit, most officers saw it as the department's quiet corner, a room where forgotten files gathered dust and waited for someone brave enough to admit defeat. But Nia didn't walk into that office to surrender to old failures. She walked in with the energy of someone who believed stubbornness could be a weapon. Her colleagues warned her, "Cold cases will eat your time. Most aren't solvable. You'll drown in dead leads." She didn't flinch. She'd grown up in Detroit. She knew the weight of unsolved hurt. She also knew that someone, somewhere, always made a mistake, and she intended to find it. The first thing she noticed was a stack of binders leaning against the far wall, each marked by year. Some were nearly collapsing under their own weight. Others hadn't been touched in so long the paper edges had yellowed. She scanned the spines until one name stopped her hand mid-reach. Rahel Simmons, 1982. She pulled the binder free. It was lighter than she expected. Too light for a case that had haunted a city. Inside were worn photographs, witness statements, maps with fading marker lines, and a few sealed evidence envelopes. As she studied the pages, something about the simplicity bothered her. There wasn't chaos. There wasn't confusion. The problem wasn't too many leads. It was the absence of them. She leaned back in her chair and whispered to herself, "Someone made sure this stayed quiet." From that moment, Rahel's case wasn't just another file. It became Nia's responsibility, a weight she accepted without hesitation and with a determination that surprised even her. She didn't care how old the case was. She cared that a 6-year-old vanished without justice, and she wasn't about to let that stand. Nia Holloway didn't believe in glancing at a file and calling it reviewed. She believed in tearing a case down to its bones. So the morning after she claimed Rahel Simmons' folder from the shelf, she spread every piece of evidence across a long steel table like she was preparing for surgery. Gloves on, mind sharp, distractions locked out. The mismatched sock sat in its aging evidence bag, sealed since the early 80s. The fibers inside hadn't been touched in decades. The air in the room felt heavy as she studied it, imagining the tiny foot it once warmed. Nearby, the chalk fragments were stored together. Pink pieces, each one carrying the final seconds of a child's last known moment of freedom. Most detectives before her had accepted the limits of the old collection methods, but Nia didn't. She called in a modern lab team, requesting more advanced testing, dust sampling from the sock, re-examination of the chalk residue, and new scans on the clothing fibers. She even requested a luminance check on the evidence envelopes themselves. Her supervisor raised an eyebrow. "You're treating this like it happened last week." She responded without looking up. Because someone treated it like that when they took her. Hour after hour, she compared notes, jotted new questions, highlighted contradictions that earlier investigators dismissed as coincidences. She noticed spacing in one report that implied something had been edited but never addressed. She found a statement with missing timestamps. She examined the original map of the neighborhood and circled an area no one ever searched thoroughly. To most detectives, Rahel's case was a dead end. To Nia, it was a challenge, a puzzle forced into silence, begging for someone to finally listen. And she listened to every inch of it. The lab technician called her at 7:14 p.m., just as Nia was preparing to leave the precinct. His voice carried a tension she recognized instantly. Not excitement, not certainty, but the quiet tremor of someone who has seen something that shouldn't exist. "We found something," he said. Her key slipped from her hand. Back in the lab, the room hummed with low machinery noise as the technician pointed to a screen displaying fragmented markers. Thin, faint peaks so small that earlier labs would have dismissed them as contamination or background noise. But modern tech could see what old instruments never could. A partial male DNA profile. Faint, imperfect, but undeniably real. It came from the sock. Nia stared at the result, heartbeat steady but heavy. Some man, had touched that sock in 1982. A ghost suddenly had fingerprints. She leaned closer. "Can you get a full profile?" "Not yet," the technician said. "We'll need multiple runs, but it's there. Someone was with her. Someone left this behind." It wasn't enough for an arrest. It wasn't enough for identification. But it was enough to breathe life back into a case that had been starved of oxygen for decades. News travels fast in a precinct, and it didn't take long for a retired man sitting at home in his worn recliner to hear the update. Sergeant Harlan Klein, older now, slower, but still carrying Rahel's name somewhere inside him, closed his eyes when he heard what Nia found. A whisper escaped him. Finally. For the first time since 1982, the case wasn't shrinking. It was opening. What Nia held in her hands wasn't just data, it was proof. Proof that Rahel didn't vanish into emptiness. Proof that a man existed in her final known moments. And if he left DNA behind, he left other things too. Nia would find them. All of them. Nia stayed long after the lab lights dimmed, staring at the faint DNA printout. It wasn't enough to solve the case. Not yet. But it was enough to force one question back into the center of everything. If this tiny trace survived 40 years, what else was waiting to be uncovered? That single thought kept her from closing the file. It kept her from walking away. It kept her pushing deeper than anyone before her. She reread the witness statements again. She reopened the neighborhood grid. She marked new areas to re-examine. Even the smallest inconsistency felt like a spark now. And as she worked, she wasn't alone. Word spread. Retired Sergeant Klein drifted back into the station on quiet afternoons, leaning over the evidence table, eyes lingering on the sock. He didn't speak much, but Nia could feel his unspoken hope filling the room. For the first time in decades, Rahel's case wasn't fading, it was rising. Should cold cases always stay open, no matter how old they get? Most people forget tragedies like this once the headlines stop. Don't be one of them. Subscribe so you stay alert to stories that still need answers. And if you won't, tell us in the comments why this case doesn't move you. The partial DNA profile felt like a lifeline, but the moment it entered CODIS, that hope shattered. The database scanned millions of offenders, arrestees, and unknown profiles collected over decades. Nia watched the progress bar with a tension that made her chest feel tight. Minutes passed. Then the final message appeared. No match found. It hit like a punch. A partial profile from a man who touched a little girl's sock in 1982. Yet not a single connection in the system. It meant he had never been arrested, never submitted DNA, never appeared on any government catalog of criminals. He was invisible, a ghost with fingerprints. The lab technician tried to soften the blow. With a sample this old, the odds were low. Nia didn't respond. She wasn't the type to hide frustration, and right now it simmered beneath every breath. She gathered the printouts and returned to the cold case unit. The silence of the room pressed in around her as she set the papers on the table. All that effort, all that hope, and still the case refused to move. But walking away wasn't an option. Not for her. She leaned over the DNA charts again and again, studying the faint markers. There was only one conclusion she could draw. The man was out there, but he didn't exist in any system she could access. So she shifted her focus. If the offender wasn't in CODIS, she needed another route, something broader, something that didn't rely on criminal history, genetic genealogy, a field that could connect distant relatives through shared markers, even if the primary subject had never interacted with law enforcement. It wasn't straightforward, it wasn't fast, but it was a door. And even the smallest door mattered when every other one had been locked for decades. Genetic genealogy wasn't designed for cases this old. It wasn't designed for fragments this faint either. But Nia didn't care. If the traditional path was a dead road, she would build a new one from scratch. All she needed was one shared marker, one strand connecting the unknown man to someone, anyone, still living. She uploaded the cleaned DNA segments into the genealogy database and waited. An hour passed. Then two. Finally, a list appeared. Not suspects, not even close, just distant relatives. People scattered across the country who happened to share microscopic portions of DNA with the unknown man. Second cousins, third cousins, half-relatives that barely made sense. A few had profiles so incomplete she had to squint to decode them. But it was something. Nia began charting the matches on a massive whiteboard that stretched across an entire wall of the cold case unit. She wrote names, circled connections, drew lines between families who didn't know each other existed. Soon the board looked less like an investigation and more like an explosion of possibilities. Every new match split into two more. Every branch grew another branch. Every answer opened the door to 10 more questions. She contacted a genealogist for technical guidance. He warned her, "This can take years, sometimes decades." She replied without hesitation, 42 years have already passed. I'm not backing down now." So she built family trees. Then she built trees for those trees. She traced ancestors through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, war registries, immigration logs, and handwritten archives buried deep in digital databases. The further she went, the more she understood one brutal truth. This wasn't just a puzzle. It was a forest, and she was trying to navigate it with a lone leaf as her guide. But that leaf carried a little girl's last hope, and that was enough to keep her moving. Most detectives clock out when the night shift ends. Nia Holloway did the opposite. She came alive when the precinct emptied and the hum of conversation faded into stillness. Those quiet hours became her refuge, the only time she could stare at her sprawling genealogical maps without interruption, letting her thoughts roam through the maze of names that stretched across decades. Coffee cups piled up on her desk. Sticky notes covered the edges of her monitor. Her phone buzzed with reminders she no longer had the energy to acknowledge. She wasn't just working the case, she was living inside it. Every night she returned to the board and traced the lines again, looking for the branch that felt out of place. She cross-referenced cousins who had never met, charted migrations from Michigan to the West Coast, and pinpointed families who might have had reason or opportunity to intersect with Rahel's world in 1982. Some nights she got lost in birth records so old the ink looked like it could crumble off the page. Other nights she sat in silence, staring at a cluster of names that refused to connect in any meaningful way. The frustration cut deep, but so did the responsibility. She whispered to the empty room more than once, "There's an answer here. I know there is. Where are you hiding?" Colleagues noticed the change in her. She skipped breaks. She stayed long after her shift ended. Her once sharp voice softened into a steady, exhausted rasp. But she didn't complain. Obsession wasn't a burden to her. It was fuel. And the longer she dug, the more she sensed she was closing in, even if progress sometimes felt microscopic. Somewhere in that tangled forest of distant relatives, someone held the key. Someone who didn't know their DNA was about to crack a case 4 decades old. Nia wasn't stopping until she found them. Weeks blurred into months, and the whiteboard in the cold case unit became a dense thicket of names, dates, places, and arrows. Anyone else would have sworn it looked impossible, a labyrinth with no exit. But Nia stood before it night after night, refusing to let exhaustion dictate the outcome. Then during one of those late hours when the world outside slept, she noticed something small. Not a breakthrough, not a revelation, just a quiet detail in a corner of the board. A name connected to several distant branches, but never fully explored. It wasn't a suspect. It wasn't even someone from Michigan. It was simply connected. A relative who had never heard of Rahel Simmons. A relative who had uploaded their DNA casually, never imagining it would reach across 40 years to tug on a thread of buried truth. The clue that solved this case came from someone who never knew Rahel existed, Nia whispered, staring at the barely noticed name. She didn't know it yet, but this tiny spark, this overlooked stranger, was the beginning of the unraveling of a 42-year mystery. One branch, One match. Waiting quietly for someone determined enough to see it. Tamsin Bell wasn't chasing family secrets. She wasn't searching for lost relatives or trying to uncover dramatic roots. She lived a calm life in a coastal California town where mornings smelled of salt water and evenings drifted by without urgency. Her curiosity about ancestry came from boredom, not ambition. One afternoon, while scrolling on her phone with a cup of iced coffee beside her, she saw a discount banner for a DNA kit and thought, why not? She swabbed her cheek, sealed the tube, and dropped it into the mailbox on her walk to the beach. She didn't think about it again. Weeks later, her inbox pinged with the results. Most people would skim through charts and heritage breakdowns with excitement. Tamsin barely glanced at them before closing the app. Instead, she reopened a photo of her dog and went on with her day. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly have imagined, was that her DNA upload didn't just sit quietly in a database. It triggered something, a distant link, a faint connection that reached across the country. While Tamsin brushed sand off her feet and planned dinner, a genealogy algorithm examined her sample. It compared her markers with millions of others. It traced patterns backward through generations of relatives she had never met. And then it stopped. Matched. Flagged. Second cousin relationship detected. But not to a cousin she'd ever heard of. Not to someone living an ordinary life. Her DNA linked to a decades-old crime, a frozen investigation, and a little girl Detroit refused to forget. Tamsin wouldn't learn any of this until much later. But at that moment, her casual choice, a $59 kit she barely cared about, became the first real spark in a case that had slept in silence for 42 years. A spark Detective Nia Holloway was about to see. The alert came through at 6:42 a.m., long before most detectives reached their desks. Nia Holloway was halfway through her first cup of coffee when her screen flashed with a notification she hadn't seen in months, not since she first uploaded the unknown male DNA profile. New genetic match detected. Second cousin range. For a moment, she simply stared at the message. Second cousin? That was close. Close enough to matter. Close enough to finally move the needle. She opened the file and there it was. Tamsin Bell, California. A stranger. A completely unrelated woman living a quiet life on the West Coast. Yet her DNA sat dangerously near the center of a mystery that had outlived entire careers. Nia zoomed in on the genetic markers, comparing them to the partial profile from the sock. The overlap wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was strong enough to confirm one thing. Tamsin Bell shared blood with the man who took Rahel Simmons. The old frustration dissolved into adrenaline. Nia rushed to the whiteboard, pulling down branches and scribbling new lines, trying to map Tamsin into the sprawling forest she had built over months. Every ancestor she documented added another layer of clarity. Every branch she traced pulled her closer to the truth. Tamsin's grandparents, their siblings, their children, their cousins. Nia mapped them one by one, building a historical blueprint of a family that never knew its own shadow, stretched all the way back to 1982. Names began forming clusters, clusters shaped into patterns. Patterns narrowed into something sharper. Finally, through all the noise, a single thread stood out, a lineage that carried weight, distance, and a troubling history. The Bell line connected directly to another family, a family with multiple sons, a family with one name circled on an old police report from decades ago. The moment Nia saw that connection, she stopped breathing for half a second. She wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. The tree had roots, and those roots were pointing at a real man. By noon, Nia had traced Tamsin Bell's lineage far enough to connect it to an extended family branch back in the Midwest. A branch with 4 brothers. 4 men born in a narrow stretch of years. 4 men who shared the same ancestors Tamsin did. 4 possible relatives of the unknown male whose DNA had clung to Rahel's sock. Their names formed a neat row on Nia's whiteboard. Elliot Locke, Matthew Locke. Jonas Locke, Vernon Locke. She studied them one by one. Elliot lived in Florida, ran a hardware store, and had never set foot in Michigan according to property records. No criminal history, not even a parking issue. His timeline didn't align with 1982. Matthew became a paramedic in Chicago. Clean record, documented shifts, married with twins. The man's entire adult life was logged in public records, shift reports, and union files. Jonas, the youngest, had passed away years earlier from an illness. His life appeared uneventful, his movements well accounted for. Nothing connected him to Detroit. Then there was Vernon Locke, the oldest brother, the quiet one, the one who drifted from job to job, the one with gaps in his history, years where he seemed to vanish from every record except the occasional address change. Nia leaned in closer. Vernon's file wasn't thick, but what she saw unsettled her. A few complaints from neighbors, a restraining order filed in the early 90s, a probation note with missing details. Nothing enough to convict him of anything, but just enough to feel wrong. And then she found it, a Detroit address from 1982. Her pulse surged. 3 brothers with documented lives and locations. One brother whose past looked like a wall of silence. Nia circled Vernon's name 3 times. Not proof, not yet. But he was now the storm in the center of her map. All signs pointed to him. All roads narrowed toward him. The forest she'd been lost in suddenly had a path. Nia didn't rush her conclusion. She confirmed it. She checked Vernon Locke's records again, matching each year of his life against the family tree she'd built. Every line she traced tightened the noose around the timeline. Every archived document, every rental record, every employer reference placed him closer and closer to Detroit in the early 80s. And then she found the final link. A relative's handwritten family note recorded Vernon spending a few months in Michigan during the exact year Rahel disappeared. It wasn't an official document, not a police file, just a scribble in the margin of an old genealogy chart, a detail so small no one else would have noticed. But to Nia, it hit like a jolt. The bloodline connected, the timeline connected, and the unexplained gaps in Vernon's past connected. The case that had suffocated under decades of silence suddenly had direction. She stepped back from the board, staring at the path she had carved from a faint DNA trace to a living man who thought time had buried his secret forever. Most people don't realize a simple ancestry upload could reopen a cold case. One random person's curiosity cracked a 42-year mystery. You never know which subscriber becomes the turning point in a case. If you're still watching without subscribing, say why. What's stopping you from making a difference? Vernon Locke lived the kind of life that barely made a ripple. His small house sat at the edge of rural Michigan, tucked between tall trees and a gravel road that saw more deer than cars. The neighbors described him with words that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Quiet, keeps to himself, never causes trouble, always alone. But that silence was exactly why he survived this long. His days ran on a strict cycle: sunrise coffee on his porch, a drive into town for groceries twice a week, occasional visits to a hardware store where he never spoke more than a sentence. He didn't use social media, didn't attend community events, didn't form friendships. He lived like a man who believed invisibility was safety. Detective Nia Holloway and her surveillance team watched him from unmarked cars parked at different points along his rural route. They saw no signs of guilt, no outbursts, no suspicious activity. That was the unsettling part. Guilt leaves traces, but Vernon Locke lived as if he had scrubbed every corner of his past clean. Yet the stillness around him was its own alarm. He avoided cameras. He avoided crowds. He avoided anything that required filling out forms or leaving paper trails. People who have nothing to hide don't live like that. Nia logged every movement he made, every habit that repeated, every pattern he leaned on. Vernon stepped out of his home at the same time every morning. He bought the same brand of coffee. He paid with cash. He drove a truck so old it barely had electronic systems. He had spent 40 years perfecting the art of leaving no trace. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his DNA, not his behavior, had already betrayed him. And the team watching him was waiting for the single moment he slipped. Surveillance is patience stretched thin, and with Vernon Locke, patience became a test of endurance. Nia's team rotated shifts in unmarked sedans, parking behind gas stations, abandoned lots, and the side of a rural church just to maintain eyes on him without drawing suspicion. Every hour was logged, every pattern studied, every deviation noted. But Vernon rarely deviated. He moved through his days with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who believed no one would ever come for him. He drove to the same diner on Tuesdays and Fridays, sat in the same booth, ordered the same black coffee and plain toast. He wore the same heavy jacket no matter the weather. He never spoke unless directly addressed, and even then his answers were clipped, almost rehearsed. The first 3 days yielded nothing worth acting on. No discarded items, no impulse decisions, no mistakes. It was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Day 4 pushed the team to the edge. Hours passed with Vernon barely moving from his porch. One investigator muttered, "Does this guy ever leave the house?" Another replied, "Not often enough." But Nia kept her focus. "People like him don't stay perfect forever," she said. "Patterns crack." She was right. On day 6, Vernon drove into town earlier than usual. That alone set alarms in the surveillance cars. He took a longer route, stopped at a different gas station, and lingered inside for a full minute, something he had never done before. When he walked out holding a cup of coffee he hadn't purchased inside the diner. Nia scribbled a note. He was shifting. Something in his routine had finally wobbled. The team leaned in closer, eyes sharp, breath tight. They didn't know it yet, but they were only hours away from the moment that would end 4 decades of questions. On Friday morning, the team followed Vernon Locke into town, tension rising with every turn of his truck. Instead of heading straight home after errands, he made an unexpected stop. The small diner he visited twice each week. Nia's pulse kicked up. This place, more than anywhere else, offered the one thing they needed, a mistake. Vernon walked in, took his usual booth against the wall and ordered coffee. The steam curled upward as he lifted the cup, drinking slowly, eyes drifting toward the window as if lost in a world only he understood. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, set it down, picked it up again, set it down once more. Every gesture mattered. Nia and an undercover officer entered from the opposite door, blending in with the lunch crowd. They chose a booth 2 tables away, close enough to watch, far enough to appear unnoticed. Vernon finished his coffee, folded his napkin once, then again, and left it sitting neatly on the table. As he stood, he didn't look back. Not at the napkin, not at the cup, not at the people around him. He simply walked out. The moment the door shut behind him, the undercover officer rose. With a single smooth motion, he scooped the cup and napkin into a bag disguised as takeout waste and exited through the side door. Outside, the evidence tech waiting by the alley took the bag without a word and drove straight to the lab. The team regathered in their cars. No one spoke, but every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. Meanwhile, at the lab, technicians rushed the samples into processing. Gloves snapped, machines whirred, screens flickered with raw data. Techs moved with urgency, knowing this wasn't just another assignment, it was a window that could slam shut at any second. Hours later, late enough that the lab lights should have been off, one machine beeped, a result appeared, a profile formed, and the room fell silent. The DNA wasn't just similar, it was identical. The ghost they'd been chasing for 42 years had finally left his footprint. The lab technician didn't call this time. He didn't need to. At 9:17 p.m., Nia's computer chimed with a new message. A tone she had heard 1,000 times, never with this much weight behind it. She opened the email, and there it was in bold lettering. Case match confirmed. For a few seconds, she just stared. No blinking, no breathing, no movement. It was real. The DNA from the diner cup matched the partial profile from Rahel's sock. The man who vanished into obscurity for 4 decades finally had a name that no one could hide behind anymore. Vernon Locke. The ghost was no longer a shadow. He was a living, breathing suspect. Nia closed her eyes, letting the moment settle. A case that the city had mourned, abandoned, and turned into legend had just cracked open because of a paper cup and a quiet man who believed time would shield him forever. Not anymore. If you're not subscribed yet, tell us what stops you. Your feedback shapes future investigations and helps us keep stories like this alive. The morning Vernon Locke was arrested, the world around him looked exactly the same. Calm sky, still trees, gravel shifting under his boots as he stepped outside. He had no idea that unmarked vehicles were already positioned along the road, engines humming low, each one filled with officers waiting for the signal. Nia Holloway stood beside the lead car, her jaw set, her eyes locked on the front door of his house. She'd imagined this moment for months. The instant when the man who had slipped through the hands of an entire city would finally face justice. But imagining it didn't prepare her for the cold rush that hit when the team moved in. 3 officers approached from the left, 2 from the right. Every step was measured. Vernon turned when he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. For half a heartbeat, his face remained blank. Then his eyes flicked to the badges, and something inside him collapsed. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He didn't even pretend not to understand what this was about. He simply froze. "Vernon Locke," an officer said, "you're under arrest." His hands lifted slowly, as if they were heavier than his entire body. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, and the quiet morning shattered. Neighbors peeked from windows. Dogs barked in distant yards. A man who had lived unnoticed for 40 years now stood exposed in front of everyone. Nia stepped forward, meeting his eyes. "You know why we're here." For the first time in decades, Vernon's mask slipped. His gaze trembled, not with defiance, but with a dread that suggested he'd been waiting for this day, praying it wouldn't come, but knowing deep down it eventually would. As they led him to the car, the silence he had built his entire life upon finally cracked. The truth was about to come out, and once it did, nothing about Rahel Simmons' story would ever be the same again. The interrogation room felt too small for the weight Vernon carried inside it. He sat hunched over the metal table, wrists cuffed, eyes fixed on a single scratch in the surface, as if it could shield him from what was coming. His breathing was shallow, uneven. The bravado most suspects cling to in the first hour never touched him. He looked like a man whose excuses had finally run out. Nia Holloway entered with a folder under her arm. Not thick, not dramatic, just enough to slice through whatever was left of his defenses. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She didn't need to. "Vernon," she said calmly, "your DNA puts you with Rahel Simmons the day she disappeared." His shoulders twitched. A tiny movement, but enough. She slid the photo of 6-year-old Rahel across the table. Her gap-toothed smile froze him like a blow to the chest. He stared at the picture, jaw tight, lips pressed together so hard they turned pale. "You took her," Nia said. At first he shook his head. A weak denial, the kind a person gives when they know it won't hold. His fingers twitched. His breathing sped up. Then something in him broke. Not loud, not dramatic, but quietly, like a thread snapping after years of tension. His voice cracked. "I didn't hurt her." Nia leaned forward. "Where is she?" He covered his face with his hands. His words leaked through his fingers, one confession at a time. "I couldn't stand being alone anymore. I thought I could give her a better life. I changed her name. She doesn't know who she is." Each statement came out jagged, pieces of a truth he'd held shut for decades. "She's alive," he finally whispered. The room went still. Nia's breath caught. The recording device on the table blinked, capturing every word that rewrote the last 42 years. Rahel Simmons hadn't died. She had been hidden, raised, renamed, and now at last, the lie that kept her in the shadows was falling apart. Once Vernon started talking, the dam broke. Decades of secrecy spilled out in fragments, each one more twisted, more disorienting than the last. He sat slumped forward, fingers tangled in his hair, his voice trembling like someone confessing to a crime he had convinced himself wasn't a crime at all. "I didn't take her to hurt her," he muttered. "I took her because I thought she was supposed to be mine." Nia kept her expression steady, but inside every instinct sharpened. "Tell me what you did, Vernon." He swallowed hard. "I brought her to the woods, to my cabin, far from everyone. She was terrified at first. She cried for days." His voice thinned. "But I told her no one was coming, that she belonged with me now." Nia felt her stomach tighten. "What did you call her?" Vernon's eyes flicked up, glassy and raw. "Ilara," he whispered. "Her name is Ilara." He said it with a softness that made Nia's skin crawl. affection wrapped around delusion. She didn't. She didn't know she was someone else, he continued. I kept her inside when she was younger. No television, no visitors. I homeschooled her. I taught her the world was dangerous. I told her people out there wanted to take her away. He exhaled shakily. But I never laid a hand on her, never hurt her. I made sure she had food, books, safety. I kept her away from everything that could confuse her. Confuse her? Nia repeated, her voice low. You erased her. Vernon flinched. I gave her a life, a simple one. She doesn't know who Rahel is. She doesn't remember Detroit. She barely remembers being 6. I tried to make it right. There was nothing right about it. He hadn't raised a child. He had built a cage. Where is she now? Nia asked. Vernon's answer came out hollow. At the cabin. Same place. She doesn't leave much. She trusts me. Those words chilled the room, because trust gained through captivity isn't trust. It's dependency carved from isolation. And somewhere in those woods, Rahel Simmons, now Elara, was living a life built entirely on a lie. The moment Vernon uttered the words, she's at the cabin, the room snapped into motion. Nia stood so quickly her chair scraped across the floor. Officers outside the door moved in a surge, radios crackling with rapid-fire instructions. There was no debate, no hesitation. A living victim was waiting, unaware her entire world was built on lies. A convoy assembled within minutes, marked cars, unmarked units, emergency lights off to avoid alerting anyone in the woods. Nia climbed into the lead vehicle, gripping the dashboard as the team sped toward the rural stretch Vernon had described. Every mile felt like a countdown. Not to danger, but to a truth no one was emotionally prepared for. What state would Elara be in? Did she know her life was stolen? Would she trust them? Recognize them? Fear them? As they turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, the forest swallowed the sound of their engines. The structure appeared slowly, sitting quiet and still, smoke drifting from its chimney like nothing was wrong inside. But something was wrong. Something had been wrong for 42 years. They stepped out of their vehicles, hearts pounding, breaths tight. They were seconds from changing a woman's entire reality. Some call this a miracle. Others call it 42 years of captivity. What do you think? The cabin looked almost peaceful from a distance. A small wooden structure tucked between tall pines, sitting so deep in the forest that daylight barely reached its windows. Smoke drifted from the chimney in thin strands, curling into the cold air like a quiet signal that life existed inside. To anyone driving by, it might have seemed ordinary, maybe even comforting. To Nia Holloway, it was the endpoint of a 42-year nightmare. The convoy stopped far back along the dirt road. Officers stepped out, boots sinking into soft ground, breaths forming clouds in the morning air. The forest muffled everything. Even the crunch of gravel felt muted. This place wasn't just remote. It felt untouched by the world. Nia motioned for silence. They advanced slowly, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, every creak of wood. Each step carried the weight of a truth no one could fully prepare for. The woman inside had no idea that her entire life was about to split in half. As they approached the porch, the stillness became heavier. No radio, no television, no signs of modern life. Just the faint sound of movement inside. The light shuffle of someone who had lived alone for far too long. Nia raised her fist and knocked. The sound echoed through the trees like a stone dropped into still water. Moments passed. Then the door opened a few inches, revealing a woman with cautious eyes, her hair tied messily, her posture tense, as if she were bracing for something she couldn't name. Her face carried the softness of someone untouched by crowds, untouched by the world, untouched even by her own history. She looked at the officers with confusion. Not fear, not anger, just a quiet bewilderment. This was Elara, a woman shaped by isolation, a woman who didn't know she once had another name, a woman who didn't know the truth was finally at her doorstep. Nia took a breath. "Elara," she said gently, "we need to talk." The forest held its breath. Elara stepped back as the officers entered, not resisting, but watching them with a guarded confusion. The kind that comes from a lifetime of being told the world outside your walls isn't safe. Her movements were slow, measured, as if she'd learned to exist quietly so she wouldn't disturb whatever fragile balance held her life together. Inside, the cabin felt frozen in time. Books stacked in small, neat piles, a single coat hanging by the door, homemade jars of preserves lining the shelves, a wood stove crackling softly. Everything suggested a life lived in repetition, the same chores, the same meals, the same silence filling every corner. There were no photographs, no letters, no phone, nothing that connected her to anyone beyond the trees surrounding this place. It was a home built to keep a person small. Nia's eyes drifted to a table where an old notebook lay open. Inside were pages of handwriting, careful, tidy, childlike in its simplicity. Lists of chores, basic math problems, short reflections, nothing personal, nothing emotional, nothing that revealed her inner world. It was the writing of someone who'd been taught to stay inside boundaries she didn't create. "Ilara," Nia asked softly, "has anyone visited you recently?" Ilara shook her head. "No, it's just me. That's how it's always been." There was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance, as if the idea of having a life beyond these walls had never crossed her mind. She glanced toward the officers again, eyes flicking from uniform to badge to weapon, trying to understand what their presence meant. Vernon had never prepared her for something like this. He had taught her to avoid strangers, not welcome them. But she wasn't scared, just unsure, like someone trying to read a language she'd never learned. Nia spoke gently, careful not to overwhelm her. "We're here because we need to tell you something important." Ilara blinked, her brow tightening. "Did I do something wrong?" The question landed in Nia's chest like a blow, because the only wrong here was the life this woman had been forced to live, and the truth waiting to reach her would reshape everything she believed about herself. Nia signaled to one of the officers, who carefully stepped forward and handed her a slim folder. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she watched Ilara, the way she stood with her hands loosely clasped, the way her eyes moved from face to face trying to decode the tension in the room. "Ilara," Nia said softly, "I want you to look at something, and I want you to know we're here to help you, no matter what you feel." Ilara nodded, though her uncertainty deepened. Nia opened the folder and slowly slid out a single photograph, the image of a 6-year-old girl standing in a Detroit driveway, chalk dust on her hands, a gap-toothed grin beaming at the camera. The photo that had circulated for decades. The photo burned into the memory of an entire city. She held it out. Ilara stared at it without reaching for it. Her eyes narrowed slightly as if she were trying to pull something from the edges of her memory. Something buried, something smothered long ago. She leaned closer, her breath caught. "That," her voice trembled a little. "That looks like me." Nia nodded. "It is you." Ilara didn't move. She didn't speak. Her expression didn't break into shock or tears. Instead, she went still, completely still, as if her body was trying to make sense of a truth her mind couldn't process. She finally touched the photo with the tip of her finger, almost afraid to hold it. "I don't remember this," she whispered. "I don't remember being there. I don't remember her." The silence that followed was heavy, a silence filled with the weight of 42 stolen years. Nia stepped closer, her voice steady but gentle. "Your name isn't Ilara. You were taken when you were 6. Your real name is Rahel Simmons." The words didn't break Ilara open. They hollowed her out. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Her eyes flickered with something between confusion and an ache she didn't have the vocabulary to express. Because how do you mourn a life you never knew was yours? How do you reconcile a childhood you can't remember with a name you've never heard? The woman before them wasn't resisting. She was unraveling from the inside, quietly, silently, as the truth began rewriting her identity with every breath. Ilara, Rahel, stood in the doorway of the small cabin, staring out into the trees that had shaped every day of her life. Those woods were her entire world. Every trail, every clearing, every season. She had never stepped beyond them without him. She had never questioned the limits he set. She had never imagined another life existed out there, waiting for her. Now she was being asked to walk away from it all in a single night. Nia waited beside her, giving her space to breathe. No rushing, no demands, just a quiet presence, strong enough to lean on if she needed it. You don't have to understand everything right now, Nia told her gently. You just need to know you're safe, and that your real life, the one that was stolen, is still yours to reclaim. Ilara swallowed hard. My whole world is here, she murmured. But something in me keeps saying I shouldn't feel this afraid. That feeling, Nia replied, is the part of you that remembers who you were meant to be. It took a long moment before Ilara finally took a step forward. One hesitant, trembling step out onto the porch. The boards creaked under her weight. The wind brushed through her hair. The trees swayed like they were whispering their own goodbye. A second step, a third, and then she crossed the threshold. For the first time in 42 years, Rahel Simmons walked away from the place that had kept her hidden from the world, and walked toward the truth she never knew belonged to her. The officers didn't crowd her. They simply guided her toward the vehicle waiting at the end of the dirt path. Every footstep felt like cracking ice, fragile, uncertain, but moving. When she reached the car, she paused, taking one last look at the cabin. Her voice was barely audible. I don't know who I'm supposed to be now. Nia opened the car door for her. That's the part we'll figure out together. Rahel stepped inside. The door closed, and the life she'd been forced to live was finally behind her. Subscribe to stay prepared. Stories like this prove the world is stranger than you think. And if you're still on the fence, leave a comment explaining why. Truth like this doesn't wait for anyone. The drive to the secure facility felt unreal to Anya and Dexter Simmons. They had taken this route before, years ago, when police called about false alarms, bodies that weren't Rahel, sightings that dissolved into dust. But this time, no one spoke in vague promises. No one said, we'll see. Every officer escorting them moved with the kind of composure that only appears when something monumental is about to happen. Anya sat in the back seat, clutching the edge of her coat so tightly her knuckles trembled. She looked out the window, barely blinking, her mind fighting between hope and terror. For 42 years, she had trained herself not to imagine this moment. Fantasizing about reunions was how she survived the first decade. After that, hope turned into something that felt like betrayal. Like allowing herself to heal meant letting Rahel drift into memory. Dexter kept his hands pressed together, elbows on his knees, leaning forward in silence. His jaw moved occasionally, as if he were reminding himself to breathe. He had always been the one who held the family together during the early years, the one who put up the missing posters, led the searches, coordinated with the police. But age had worn him down. Now he looked like a man heading into a moment too heavy for his bones. When the vehicle finally stopped outside the facility, neither of them moved right away. The building wasn't large or imposing. It looked like any secure government office. But they knew what waited inside would redefine their entire existence. A young officer opened the door for them. Mr. and Mrs. Simmons, she's here. That single sentence took 42 years to arrive. Dexter exhaled a breath that broke in the middle. Anya's legs trembled as she stepped out. Every hallway they walked through felt too quiet, too clean, too calm, nothing like the storm inside their chests. For the first time in decades, they weren't walking toward despair. They were walking toward their daughter. Anya and Dexter stood outside a plain gray door. No nameplate, no window, nothing to hint at the magnitude of what waited behind it. Yet every emotion they had suppressed for over 4 decades pressed against their ribs, rising like a wave they could barely brace themselves for. Dexter's hand hovered near the doorframe, not touching it, just trembling in the air. I don't know if I'm ready, he whispered, his voice breaking in a way Anya had never heard. Anya's fingers curled into the fabric of her shirt. Her breathing turned shallow, uneven. What if she doesn't know us? She murmured. What if we're strangers to her? The officer beside them looked down, giving them the dignity of a moment. She's nervous too, he said quietly. She asked if you'd be kind. That sentence shattered something inside Anya. Kind. A child stolen for 42 years was asking if her parents would be kind. Dexter closed his eyes, pressing a hand to his forehead as if holding himself together. Every failure, every search that ended nowhere, every missed birthday, every moment he gave up hope only to feel guilty afterward, crashed into him at once. The officer lifted his hand to the handle. "Are you ready?" Neither of them answered. He opened the door slowly. Inside the small room stood a woman with her hands clasped together, gripping them tight as though grounding herself. Her posture was small, almost protective. Her eyes darted up at the sound of the door, then froze on the two people stepping inside. Ilara, Rahel, their daughter. Anya covered her mouth with both hands. Dexter's knees nearly buckled. Ilara didn't speak. She didn't run to them. She didn't recoil. She simply stared, confused and searching, as if trying to match faces to a life she couldn't remember. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was loaded. 42 years of fear, longing, guilt, hope, and questions all pressing into one fragile moment. For a long moment, no one moved. Ilara stood as still as stone, her eyes flicking between the two strangers who carried the weight of a lifetime she couldn't recall. Her breath trembled. Her fingers pressed into each other until her knuckles turned white. Anya took a single step forward. Not fast, not desperate. Just a step filled with a mother's fear of frightening the child she had lost, and the woman she hoped still existed somewhere inside her. "Ilara," Anya whispered, testing the name gently before letting the next one out. "Rahel." Ilara blinked, her gaze tightening, searching Anya's face for something familiar. Something that felt like home. Anya swallowed, tears spilling as she lifted a trembling hand to her chest. "There's something I used to call you," she said, voice cracking on every word. "Something only you and I said." Dexter looked at her, startled. He hadn't known she planned to say it. Maybe she didn't either. Maybe it was instinct, a mother grasping for the one thread that might tug a buried memory to the surface. Anya inhaled shakily. Her voice fell to a whisper. "My little T-Rex artist." Ilara's head jerked slightly. Her eyes widened. Not in recognition, but in a momentary flash of emotion she couldn't hide fast enough. Something flickered deep inside her, like a spark catching against old, dry memory. A faint image passed behind her eyes, tiny hands gripping chalk, drawing dinosaurs with oversized teeth, giggling when the lines didn't stay inside the shapes. She lifted her hand unconsciously, touching her own cheek the way she once did when concentrating on her drawings. Her lips parted. I don't know why," she said softly, "but that feels familiar." Anya broke. She pressed both hands to her mouth, sobbing through the kind of joy and grief only a parent in this position could understand. Dexter stepped forward, his voice deep, shaking. "You loved drawing dinosaurs. You said they were brave, like you wanted to be." Ilara's eyes filled with tears she didn't fully understand. Her identity, carefully constructed under Locke's control, began to crack. Rahel was starting to stir. A soft knock at the door broke the moment. A medical technician stepped inside quietly, holding a slim folder against his chest. He paused when he saw the scene. Anya trembling, Dexter standing rigid, Ilara caught between worlds. He spoke gently. "We have the results." Dexter turned first, his breath stuttering in his chest. Anya wiped her face with shaking hands, trying to compose herself. Ilara stepped back slightly, instinctively bracing herself, the weight of too many unknowns pressing against her ribs. The folder was set on the table. The technician slid two documents forward, one with dental comparison charts, the other with DNA confirmation. Numbers, matches, percentages, timelines. All the science needed to support the one truth this family had been denied for decades. "It's a positive identification," he said quietly. "It's her. It's Rahel." Anya let out a sound that was half sob, half relief, her knees giving out as she sank into the nearest chair. Dexter pressed both hands to his face, shoulders shaking, years of locked-away grief tearing free. But Ilara, she just stared at the paper with a look that held confusion, wonder, and fear all tangled together. "That's really me," she whispered. Dexter knelt beside her. He didn't reach out. He didn't touch her. He simply met her gaze with a softness she hadn't seen in years. "You were taken from us," he said, voice breaking, "but you were never forgotten. Not for one day." Anya leaned in, tears streaking down her cheeks. "You survived, Rahel. You didn't lose yourself. You're right here." Elara's breath trembled. A small, fragile sound escaped her lips. A sob she tried to swallow but couldn't. She brought a hand to her chest, gripping her shirt as if steadying her own heartbeat. For the first time, she didn't look lost. She looked overwhelmed, but connected. Rahel Simmons was no longer a missing child on a weathered poster. She was alive, seen, and finally claimed by the people who never stopped waiting. Which moment in this reunion hit you hardest? Share below. Your insight might help someone who's lived through loss. When the news broke, Detroit stopped. Not slowed, not paused, stopped. For decades, the name Rahel Simmons lived in the city like a bruise that never healed. A reminder of a little girl who vanished on a warm September afternoon and left a community drowning in guilt, fear, and unanswered questions. Every few years, someone would mention her during a neighborhood gathering. Teachers would tell new parents, "We still remember her." Old flyers remained taped to garage walls, wrinkled and faded, untouched out of respect. So when the alert went out, "Missing child from 1982 found alive," people didn't believe it at first. Some thought it was a cruel joke. Others thought it was misreporting. But then the police chief gave a statement, confirming everything. Rahel had survived. She had been alive all along, hidden, shielded, stolen. Across the city, shock hit like a tidal wave. At a bakery in East Detroit, a woman who had attended every single chalk vigil dropped her rolling pin and burst into tears. At a community center, elders who once walked door to door with flashlights the night Rahel vanished gathered around a laptop, whispering prayers of gratitude. On social media, people resurrected old childhood memories. "I remember drawing with her in the driveway. I can't believe she's alive." Purple chalk drawings appeared again, on sidewalks, driveways, school steps. Dinosaurs, hearts, her name. A tribute to the child they feared they'd lost forever. Detroit wasn't just celebrating a miracle. It was grieving the years that were stolen, processing the shock that something once frozen in time had suddenly shifted, cracked open, breathed again. For the first time in a long time, hope didn't feel imaginary. It felt real. It felt earned. Detective Nia Holloway never imagined the case would end this way. She had taken on the Simmons file out of duty, but it became something far deeper, an anchor she couldn't put down. When the confirmation email arrived, she didn't shout, she didn't celebrate. She just sat at her desk, staring at the screen as the reality settled in. She had rewritten a story that everyone else believed was sealed shut. Within hours, the media flooded the department with requests. National networks wanted interviews, academic institutions wanted to highlight her methods, and organizations for missing children wanted her to speak about persistence and modern forensic tools. Her phone vibrated nonstop, messages stacking on top of each other. But for once, she didn't mind the noise. Because this wasn't about attention. It was about finally seeing one name, one child, move from missing to found. Meanwhile, miles away in a quiet retirement home, Sergeant Harlan Klein sat in his recliner, flipping through channels when a breaking news banner flashed across the screen. He leaned forward, squinting at the headline. "Cold case from 1982 solved. Missing girl found alive." He froze. The remote slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. For 42 years, he carried the weight of failure. He remembered every detail of the original search, the chalk drawings, the driveway, the look in Anya's eyes. He remembered the moment he realized they had no trace, no direction, no chance. And he remembered every sleepless night since, wondering what he had missed. So when the reporter said the words, "Rahel Simmons is alive," something inside him broke wide open. He covered his face, shoulders shaking, letting the tears come freely. Not out of sadness, out of release. Because the case that haunted him for a lifetime finally had an ending worthy of hope. Rahel's recovery didn't look like the joyful reunions people imagine. Healing wasn't instant. It wasn't cinematic. It was slow, uneven, and full of moments where she questioned everything she had ever known. When she entered the rehabilitation center, she carried the weight of two identities: Ilara, the woman shaped by isolation, and Rahel, the child stolen before she had a chance to understand the world. She often sat in the therapy room with her hands folded tightly, listening as professionals explained concepts most people take for granted: personal history, autonomy, trauma, choice. Some days she spoke in short, cautious sentences. Other days she barely spoke at all. Her parents visited regularly. They didn't rush her. They didn't crowd her. Dexter brought old photo albums, placing them gently on the table, letting her decide when she was ready to look. Anya brought small pieces of Rahel's childhood, drawings, dolls, tiny scribbles on crumpled paper. Each item was an invitation, not a demand. The first time Rahel traced her finger along one of her childhood chalk drawings, she whispered, "I used to make these?" Anya nodded, tears slipping silently down her face. "You loved it," she said. "You filled the driveway with colors." Therapists guided her through exercises designed to rebuild trust, memory, and emotional grounding. They explained that it wasn't her fault she couldn't recall certain things. They taught her how to navigate a world filled with technologies, choices, and freedoms she had never been allowed to experience. Every step forward came with fear. Every victory, no matter how small, carried meaning. Through it all, she learned one truth: survival wasn't the end of her story. Reclaiming her life, piece by piece, was the next chapter. Rahel wasn't just rediscovering who she was learning who she could become. For 42 years, Rahel Simmons lived as a memory, frozen in a photograph, held in the hearts of a family who refused to forget her, and whispered about in a city that could never heal the wound of her disappearance. She was a symbol of loss, a reminder of how fragile life is, and how quickly a single moment can change everything. But now she was real again, breathing, healing, learning, becoming. As Rahel slowly rebuilt her sense of self, the world watched with a mix of awe and disbelief. Her story traveled far beyond Detroit, becoming a testament to relentless investigation, scientific progress, and the kind of hope most people abandon long before the finish line. Families of other missing children wrote letters to the Simmons family, thanking them for holding on. Detectives across the country revisited their oldest cases, inspired by a single impossible outcome. And somewhere in that fragile process, Rahel began to understand something powerful. She wasn't a ghost from a tragedy. She wasn't the girl forever lost. She wasn't just the woman raised in isolation. She was someone who survived what should have broken her. She existed, despite everything. Her story circled back to the moment that started it all. The knock on a cabin door in 2024, when a woman who wasn't supposed to exist stood face to face with the truth. Detroit's long-held ache had finally found release. Her parents' decades of sleepless nights finally had meaning. A city that once mourned now honored the miracle standing before them. Rahel Simmons, gone for 42 years, was home. If this case taught us anything, it's that answers hide in unexpected places. Stay ahead of the next twist. Subscribe now. If you watch this entire story unfold, you know how quickly a life can vanish. Don't wait to learn about the next case when it's too late. Subscribe now. And if you still won't, step into the comments and tell us honestly, why?